The conference room went quiet the moment Ryan's lawyer slid the paperwork across the table. I watched the overhead fluorescent light catch the edge of the manila folder, just for a second, before my brother's hand reached for it. The hum of the building's old HVAC system suddenly felt louder than it should have been. I didn't move. I'd already seen those documents 3 days ago, in a different office, with a different lawyer. This wasn't the first time Ryan had underestimated me. It would be the last. My name is Natalie. I'm 38 years old, and for 14 years, I ran my father's construction company from a cramped office in Columbus, Ohio. Not helped run. Not assisted with operations. I ran it. Every permit. Every bid. Every contract negotiation that kept 23 families employed and fed. I earned $78,000 a year doing work that should have paid twice that, and I never complained. My father knew what I did. So did everyone else who mattered. Everyone except Ryan. I grew up in a modest split-level house on the east side of Columbus, in a neighborhood where people mowed their own lawns and knew their neighbors' names. My father started his construction business in our garage when I was 6. I remember the smell of sawdust and coffee, the sound of his boots on the concrete floor at 5 in the morning. Ryan, 3 years older than me, played soccer and brought home report cards that made our mother frame them. I brought home A's too, but somehow mine always ended up in a drawer. When I was 24 and fresh out of business school, my father offered me a job. Ryan was already working at a car dealership across town, selling trucks and talking about his commission checks at Sunday dinners. I started as an assistant, but within 2 years I was handling payroll, managing job sites, and making sure we stayed within budget and on schedule. My father didn't say much, he wasn't that kind of man, but he'd nod when I showed him the quarterly reports, and sometimes he'd leave a sticky note on my desk that just said, "Good work." Ryan visited the office maybe twice a year. Always around the holidays. Always with a story about some big sale he'd just closed. He lived in a 5-bedroom house our parents helped him buy, drove a new truck every 2 years, and had opinions about the business he never actually worked in. My mother adored him. She'd smile when he walked into a room like he'd just solved world hunger. I lived in a 2-bedroom townhouse I bought myself, drove a 7-year-old sedan, and got phone calls from my mother reminding me I should settle down and find someone. I didn't mind the imbalance. Not really. I loved the work. I loved watching a project go from blueprints to breaking ground to a finished building. I loved the crew guys who called me boss and meant it. My father and I had an understanding. We didn't need to put it into words. Then he died. It was a heart attack. Sudden. Clean. He was 67 and had just signed off on a new commercial project, the biggest contract we'd ever landed. The funeral was on a Tuesday. 200 people showed up. Clients. Crew members. Suppliers. People whose kids my father had hired when no one else would. I stood beside my mother at the front of the church and shook hands until my fingers went numb. Ryan stood beside me in a charcoal suit, his jaw tight, his hand on our mother's shoulder. He looked like he was holding the family together. Maybe he thought he was. The reception was at our parents' house. Someone had set up folding tables in the backyard. There were casseroles and pasta salads and a cooler full of beer. I was standing near the back porch, holding a paper plate I hadn't eaten from, when Ryan raised his voice. "I just want everyone to know," he said, loud enough that conversations stopped, "that I'll be taking over as CEO. Dad and I talked about it. He wanted me to lead the company forward. Natalie will stay on in her admin role, of course. Or she can leave if she wants something different. Either way, we'll be fine." The air felt very still. I looked at my brother. He was smiling. Not smug, at least not obviously. Just confident. Like he'd already made the decision and was simply informing the rest of us. A few people glanced at me. I saw Jerry, our lead foreman, frown. I saw my Aunt Linda press her lips together. My mother stood beside Ryan, silent, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't say anything. She never did when it came to him. I set my plate down on the porch railing. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "Ryan, we should talk about this privately." He waved a hand. "There's nothing to talk about," Nat Dad told me years ago. This was always the plan. That's not. He knew I'm the businessman, Ryan continued, louder now, cutting me off. You do great work, don't get me wrong. But running a company is different. You answer phones. You schedule things. I close deals. That's what we need right now. Something in me went very still. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him for a long moment, and then I walked inside. 3 days after the funeral, I was sitting in the office of Margaret Holloway, the attorney who had handled my grandmother's estate 2 years earlier. Margaret was in her early 70s, with silver hair she wore in a low bun and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She'd been a family lawyer for 40 years and had a reputation for being ferociously detail-oriented. My grandmother had trusted her completely. I'd called Margaret the morning after the reception. I didn't explain much over the phone, just said I needed to review some documents related to my grandmother's will. She'd agreed to see me that afternoon. Now, sitting across from her desk, I watched her pull a thick folder from a locked filing cabinet. The leather chair creaked as she sat down. The office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon furniture polish. She opened the folder and slid a set of stapled documents across the desk. Your grandmother was very specific, Margaret said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. She wanted to make sure you were protected. I scanned the first page. Then the second. My grandmother, my father's mother, had passed away 2 years ago. I'd known she left me something, but I'd assumed it was money. Maybe a small inheritance. Some savings bonds. This was different. She gave me 40% of the company, I said slowly. Correct. The shares were placed in an irrevocable trust until your father's passing. At that point, they transferred directly to you. No probate. No contestation. Margaret tapped the document with one finger. She told me, and I quote, Natalie is the one who shows up. She deserves to own what she's built. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not sadness. Not quite. Something sharper. Does Ryan know? No. Your grandmother specifically asked that the transfer remain private until it was finalized. She said you'd know when the time was right. I stared at the page. Signatures. Dates. Legal language that boiled down to one simple truth. I wasn't just an employee. I was an owner. And with my father gone, his shares, which represented the majority stake, were being divided according to his will. I hadn't seen that document yet, but if Ryan thought he was walking in as CEO, he clearly hadn't either. Margaret leaned back in her chair. I've been doing this a long time, Natalie. I've seen a lot of families tear themselves apart over money and control. Your grandmother saw it too. That's why she did this. Not to hurt anyone, but to make sure the person who earned it didn't get pushed aside. I folded my hands in my lap. My pulse was steady. My thoughts, surprisingly, were clear. I need to see my father's will. I can arrange that, Margaret said. I believe it's being held by his estate attorney, David Brennan. I'll make a call. 2 days later, I sat in David Brennan's office and learned that my father had left his 60% ownership stake split evenly between Ryan and me, 30% each. Combined with my grandmother's 40%, that gave me 70% total. Ryan had 30. The math was simple. The implications were not. David, a man in his mid-50s with thinning hair and a kind face, looked at me over his reading glasses. Your father never updated this after your grandmother's trust was finalized, he said carefully. I don't think he realized the full impact. Or maybe he did, and he trusted you to handle it. Ryan doesn't know. No. He hasn't requested the documents yet. He's been vocal about his plans, from what I understand. But he hasn't gone through the legal steps. I thought about my brother standing in our parents' backyard, announcing his new title to 200 grieving people. I thought about 14 years of early mornings and late nights. I thought about my grandmother's wrinkled hands and the way she used to watch me at family dinners, her eyes sharp and knowing. I need to call a board meeting, I said. David nodded slowly. I can facilitate that. The company had a small board of directors, mostly a formality. My father. My Uncle Tom, who lived in Florida and rarely voted on anything. And Patricia Simmons, our longtime accountant, who'd been with us since the beginning. With my father gone, the board was down to 2 members, and per the bylaws, Any majority shareholder could call a meeting to fill the vacancy and vote on leadership. I spent the next week preparing. Not frantically. Not emotionally. Methodically. I printed every email I'd sent on behalf of the company over the past 5 years. Contracts I'd negotiated. Budgets I'd managed. Performance reviews I'd written. Client emails thanking me by name. I saved them all to a folder on my desktop, backed them up on a flash drive, and organized them chronologically in a 3-ring binder. The sound of the hole punch echoing in my quiet townhouse felt strangely satisfying. I pulled financial reports showing the company's growth during my tenure. I highlighted revenue increases, project completions, and client retention rates. I noted every major contract I'd secured, every crisis I'd managed, every time I'd kept us from going over budget or behind schedule. Jerry, the lead foreman, stopped by my office one afternoon. He was a man in his late 50s with calloused hands and a face weathered by decades of outdoor work. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Heard Ryan's been telling people he's taking over. I've heard that too. Jerry's jaw tightened. The crew's not happy. They know who's been running things. They know who keeps their paychecks coming. I appreciate that. He hesitated. You gonna do something about it? I looked up from my desk. Met his eyes. Yes. He nodded once. Good. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10. I arrived 30 minutes early. The conference room was on the second floor of our office building, a plain, functional space with a long table, 8 chairs, and windows overlooking the parking lot. I set my binder on the table, placed a copy of the trust documents beside it, poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher someone had left on the sideboard. The ice cubes clinked softly. Patricia arrived next. She was in her 60s, with short gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She'd known me since I was 24. She sat down across from me and glanced at the documents. You've been busy, she said quietly. I have. Ryan's going to be upset. I know. She didn't say anything else. Just nodded. David Brennan arrived with Margaret Holloway. They took seats near the head of the table. My Uncle Tom called in via speakerphone from Florida, his voice crackling slightly through the connection. My mother came, too. I'd asked David to extend the invitation, even though she wasn't a board member. She sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Ryan walked in at 10:03. He was wearing a suit, navy, well-tailored, expensive. He had a leather portfolio under one arm and a coffee cup in his other hand. He smiled when he saw me. Morning, Nat, glad you could make it. He sat down at the head of the table. The chair my father used to occupy. David cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. We're here to address the transition of leadership following the passing of. Right, Ryan interrupted. I've already drafted a transition plan. I'll send it around after the meeting, but the short version is I'll take over as CEO effective immediately. Natalie will continue in her current role, reporting to me. We'll reassess her responsibilities in 6 months. I think that's the smoothest path forward. He slid a printed document across the table toward David. Patricia glanced at it but didn't touch it. I took a slow breath. The air in the room felt heavy. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound for a moment. Ryan, I said quietly, have you reviewed Dad's will? He blinked. I will. Eventually. But Dad and I talked about this. He wanted me to lead. Did he put that in writing? Ryan's smile faltered. It was understood. Margaret spoke for the first time. Her voice was calm, almost casual. Mr. Ryan, I'm Margaret Holloway. I was your grandmother's estate attorney. I think there's something you should know before this meeting continues. She slid a copy of the trust documents across the table. Ryan picked them up, frowning. I watched his eyes scan the first page, then the second. His expression shifted confusion, then disbelief, then something harder. This says Natalie owns 40%. Correct, Margaret said. Your grandmother transferred those shares to her 2 years ago. They were held in trust until your father's passing. Ryan looked at me. You knew about this? I found out last week. David leaned forward. Your father's will also divides his 60% stake equally between you and Natalie. 30% each. That brings Natalie's total ownership to 70%. Yours is 30. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Ryan's face had gone very still. He set the documents down slowly. He stopped. Started again. That doesn't make sense. Dad wouldn't. Your father's will is legally binding, David said. As is your grandmother's trust. Natalie is the majority shareholder. Patricia spoke up. Which means, per the company bylaws, she has the authority to call for a leadership vote. Ryan's eyes snapped to me. You planned this. No, I said quietly. Grandma planned this. Dad executed it. I'm just following through. This is insane. You can't run this company. You've never. I've run this company for 14 years, I said. My voice was steady. Calm. I've managed every major contract. Every budget. Every crisis. I've kept us profitable and growing while you sold cars across town. You're good at what you do, Ryan. But this isn't what you do. His jaw tightened. Mom, are you hearing this? My mother looked at him. Then at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something in her face that wasn't automatic favoritism. It was uncertainty. Maybe even guilt. Ryan, she said slowly, your grandmother did leave those shares to Natalie. I knew about it. You knew. She told me before she passed. She said Natalie had earned it. Ryan stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. This is unbelievable. You're all just going to. Mr. Ryan, Margaret said, her voice still calm, still professional. You're welcome to contest the will or the trust. But I can tell you now, both documents are ironclad. Your grandmother worked with me for months to make sure there were no loopholes. And your father had every opportunity to change his will. He didn't. David nodded. If you'd like to remain with the company, Natalie has the authority to determine your role. But the majority stake is hers. That's not negotiable. Ryan stared at me for a long moment. I didn't look away. I didn't gloat. I just waited. Finally, he shook his head. You know what? Fine. Keep it. I don't need this. He grabbed his portfolio and walked toward the door. Then he stopped. Turned back. You really think you can do this without me? I've been doing it without you for 14 years, I said. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Patricia let out a long breath. Well, that went about as well as expected. David looked at me. Do you want to proceed with the leadership vote? I nodded. Yes. It took less than 5 minutes. Patricia voted in favor of my appointment as CEO. My Uncle Tom, over the speakerphone, said, hell yes. David abstained, as the estate attorney. My mother sat quietly and didn't say anything, but she didn't object either. Margaret smiled. Just a small, private smile. Your grandmother would be proud. That was 6 months ago. I'm still CEO. The company is doing well, better than well, actually. We've landed 3 new contracts this quarter, and our client retention rate is the highest it's been in years. Jerry and the crew guys still call me boss, and now it's official. I hired a new operations manager to take over some of my old responsibilities. She's 26, sharp, and doesn't take nonsense from anyone. I like her. Ryan hasn't spoken to me since the board meeting. I heard through a mutual friend that he's still at the dealership, still selling trucks. My mother calls occasionally. The conversations are stiff and awkward, but they're happening. She told me last month that my grandmother used to say I had a spine made of rebar. I didn't know that. I wish I'd heard it from her directly. I still live in my 2-bedroom townhouse. I still drive the same sedan. But I wake up every morning knowing that the work I do is mine. Not because someone handed it to me. Not because I was the favorite. But because I earned it. Because I showed up. Because when it mattered, the people who really saw me made sure I wasn't erased. Family legacy isn't built by the people who talk the loudest or demand the most. It's built by the people who show up when it's hard. Who do the work no one sees. Who carry the weight without asking for credit. Grandma knew that. Dad knew it too, even if he never said it out loud. And now, finally, everyone else knows it. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been told you're just the worker while someone else gets the glory, I hope you know your work matters. I hope you know showing up counts. And I hope you know that sometimes, the people who really see you are working behind the scenes to make sure you're not forgotten. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to fight for what you built. I'd love to hear your story.